Hello and welcome to week 26 of the lessons of A Course in Miracles. I just wanted to real quick make sure I revamp the reason why we're doing this is we're all studying lessons of a book called A Course in Miracles. And for all of you all who are listening to this video who have the book, and if you've gotten it and you're confused as to what is all this content, what am I supposed to be getting from this? What we're doing is we are pretty much taking a lesson a day. So in about the middle of the book, is where the lessons begin. And once a day, you are just reading these lessons. You're reading and you are following instructions that Jesus has set out for you every day. So that being said, we are on lesson 26. And lesson 26 says, you would think I would have a bookmark by now. Okay, lesson 26 says, my attack thoughts are attacking my invulnerability. My attack thoughts are attacking my invulnerability. And basically, so I'm going to read a small portion from this. It says, practice with today's idea will help you to understand that vulnerability or invulnerability is the result of your own thoughts. Nothing except your thoughts can attack you. Nothing except your thoughts can make you think you are vulnerable. And nothing except your thoughts can prove to you this is not so. So, you know, Jesus goes into the power of our own thoughts because we are invulnerable. But if we have an attack thought towards somebody else, we're on the defense. And that comes from the belief that they can in fact harm us. And if we know nothing else from the lessons in A Course in Miracle, is that no one can harm you. So this is one of the most impactful lessons I have prepared, y'all. I'm so excited about this week's lesson. It is about insecurity and doubt, and it was so much fun preparing. We're continuing our healing series, and we will focus on insecurity and doubt. And I wanted to teach from one of the most impactful channeled books available to us, which is Conversations with God. Books 1, 2, and 3. And the reason I'm referencing Conversations with God is because it provides us the most relatable experience to learn from. The author of the trilogy of Conversations with God is Neale Donald Walsch. He began his journey of writing these books because of nothing other than struggle. He had an interview with Larry King, and in that interview, Walsh said that the books were written at a low period in his life. He stated that he wrote an angry letter to God, asking questions about why his life wasn't working. And after writing down all his questions, he heard a voice over his right shoulder saying, do you really want an answer to all these questions, or are you just venting? And though when he turned around, he saw no one there, he felt the answers to his questions filling his mind. And as you can imagine, it was a very powerful experience. And so he started writing down the information, and that's the dialogue that became the Conversations with God books. So book 1, I'm going to hold it up, and it's going to be hard to see, because it's white. But good book one was published in 1995 and became a publishing phenomenon. It stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 137 weeks, y'all. 137 weeks. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. So the series was so impactful that the books actually inspired a movie. I don't know, some of you all may have seen the movie. I have. It was starring Walsch in it, called Conversations with God. So that's how powerful it was and how much of an impact it made. So Neale to this day has a large YouTube following. People tune into him and listen to and follow his page, follow his social media. Conversations with God is the second most referenced book that I use in my sessions, second only to A Course in Miracles. So that's how in love I am with these books. However, so he's wildly successful, right? However, there were many times that Neale's doubts and insecurities threatened the completion of the books. Even during his dialogue with God, he still, had doubts, he had insecurities. So we're going to get into those doubts that he faced. So the first time he referenced his doubt was very early in book one. It's on page 6. And it says, so God says to Neale, my messages will come in 100 forms at 1,000 moments across 1,000,000 years. You cannot miss them if you truly listen. You cannot ignore them once truly heard. Thus will our communication begin in earnest. For in the past, you have only talked to me, God said, praying to me, interceding with me, beseeching me. Yet now I can talk back to you, even as I am doing here. So Neale says, how can I know this communication is from God? How do I know this is not my own imagination? And God says, what would be the difference? Do you not see that I could just as easily work through your imagination as anything else? I will bring you the exact right thoughts, words, or feelings at any given moment, suited precisely to the purpose at hand, using one device or several. You will know these words are from me because you, of your own accord, have never spoken so clearly. Had you already spoken so clearly on these questions, you would not be asking me. You would not be asking me them. So right now, Neale begins to question whether or not he was actually talking to God. And a lot of us would have done the same thing. Like we would have either thought we were going crazy, or like, we would have said, how do I know I'm not making this up? We are not used to taking the time to listen to God. But lesson 49 of A Course in Miracles says, God's voice speaks to me all throughout the day. I also go into great detail about this in the video titled The Voice of God. We hear God's voice all throughout the day. He also, so then I'm going to continue. I'm going to say this. He also asked the same question 100 pages later on pages 108 through 9. He asked, now this is after he didn't have much dialogue with God. He asked the same thing. He says, How do I know that what you are saying is true? How do I know this is even God speaking and not my own overactive imagination? And God says, you've asked that before. My answer is the same. What difference does it make? Even if everything I've said is wrong, can you think of a better way to live? And Neale says, no. And God says, then wrong is right and right is wrong. Yet I'll tell you this to help you out of your dilemma. Believe nothing I say. Simply live it, experience it, then live whatever other paradigm you want to construct. Afterward, look to your experience to find your truth. And God continues and says, one day, if you have a great deal of courage, you will experience a world where making love is considered better than making war. On that day, you will rejoice. So that's another time that Neale goes into, that doubt of, how do I know I'm really talking to God? So we're going to continue. I'm going back to page 6. And it says, so Neale says, to whom does God communicate? Are there special people? Are there special times? And God says, all people are special and all moments are golden. There is no person and there is no time, one more special than another. Many people choose to believe that God communicates in special ways and only with special people. This removes the mass of the people from responsibility for hearing my messages, much less receiving it, which is another matter, and allows them to take someone else's word for everything. You don't have to listen to me, for you've already decided that others have heard from me on every subject, and you have them listen, and all you have to do is listen to them. By listening to what other people think they heard me say, you don't have to think at all. This is the biggest reason for most people turning from my messages on a personal level. If you acknowledge that you are receiving my messages directly, then you are responsible for interpreting them. It is far safer and much easier to accept the interpretation of others, even others who have lived 2,000 years ago, than seek to interpret the message that you may very well be receiving in this moment right now. Yet I invite you to a new form of communication with God, a two-way communication. In truth, it is you who have invited me, God is telling Neale, for I have come to you in this form right now in answer to your call. And so Neale says, why do some people, take Christ, for example, seem to hear more of your communication than others? And so God says, because some people are willing to actually listen. They are willing to hear, and they are willing to remain open to the communication, even when it seems crazy or scary or downright wrong. So Neale says, we should listen to God even when what's being said seems wrong. And God says, especially when it seems wrong. If you think you are right about everything, who needs to talk with God? Go ahead and act on all that you know. But notice that you've all been doing that since time began. And look at what shape the world is in. Clearly, you've missed something. Obviously, there is something you don't understand. That which you do understand must seem right to you, because right is a term you use to designate something with which you agree. What you've missed will therefore appear at first to be wrong. So God is basically saying right is something that you've been basically conditioned to believe all your life and you agree with it. So that's right to you, and wrong is new information. He says the only way to move forward on this is to ask yourself, what would happen if everything I thought was wrong was actually right? Every great scientist knows about this. When what a scientist does is not working, when a scientist is working on something and it's not working, a scientist sets aside all of the assumptions and starts over. All great discoveries have been made from a willingness and ability to not be right. And that's what's needed here. You cannot know God until you stop telling yourself that you already know God. You cannot hear God until you stop thinking that you've already heard God. I cannot tell you my truth until you stop telling me yours. And so Neale says, but my truth about God comes from you. And God said, who said so? And Neale said, others. And God said, what others? And Neale said, leaders, ministers, rabbis, priests, books, the Bible, for heaven's sake. And God says, those are not authoritative sources. And Neale says, they aren't. And God says, no. And so then Neale says, then what is? And God says, listen to your feelings. Listen to your highest thoughts. Listen to your experience. Whenever any one of these differ from what you've been told by your teachers or read in your books, forget the words. Words are the least reliable purveyor of truth. So this is powerful, right? I love this. So right here, God is saying, listen to your own feelings, your own inner voice, your own highest thoughts, your own experience. And if what you are being told conflicts with that, rely on your truth rather than the words of another. Many of us have this belief that we are not special or spiritual enough to have dialogue with God. And that's for other people. I challenge everyone tonight, everyone listening to this recording, to pray to God to help you recognize his voice, to help you recognize her speech, to help you to look past the ego's voice and recognize the voice of God. I encourage everyone that during your quiet moments, ask God a question. It could be something simple, it could be something complicated. Ask God a question. Close your eyes and allow the answer to come to you. It will. It could be a feeling, it could be an inner knowing, it could come to you in a dream. Do this often and slowly allow this inner knowing, this dialogue, to strengthen over time, because God speaks to all of us. We just need to listen. So I'm going to continue in book one. I'm going to continue on page 66. Neale continues to talk about, go to the page. So Neale continues to talk about his imperfections and disbelief that he's talking to God. So I'm still in book one, and on page 66, he says, my life is not perfect, nor is it close to being perfect. I am not perfect. I am, in fact, a bundle of imperfections. I wish, sometimes I wish with all my heart that I could correct these imperfections, that I knew what causes my behaviors, what sets up my downfalls, what keeps getting in my way. That's why I've come to you, I guess. I haven't been able to find the answers on my own. And I forgot to let everybody know, like, Neale definitely had a life of struggle. He had been homeless at a point in time in his life. He was that financially strapped that he just uh was homeless. He went through divorces. His kids didn't speak to him. Like, this was the ultimate person to demonstrate that you don't have to be special in order to hear God's voice. So he had a hard knock life, as we'll say. And so God responds to him and says, I'm glad you came to me. I've always been here to help you. I'm here now. You don't have to find the answers on your own. You never had to. And so Neale says, yet it seems so presumptuous to simply sit down and dialogue with you this way, much less to imagine that you, God, are responding. I mean, this is crazy. And God says, I see. The authors of the Bible were all sane, but you are crazy. And Neale says, the Bible writers were witnesses to the life of Christ and faithfully recorded what they heard and saw. And God said, correction. Most of the New Testament writers never met or saw Jesus in their lives. They lived many years after Jesus left the earth. They wouldn't have known Jesus of Nazareth if they walked into him on the street. So, of course, I died laughing after that. And so Neale says, and so God continues, he said, the Bible writers were great believers and great historians. They took the stories which had been passed down to them and to their friends by others, elders from elder to elder, until finally a written record was made. And not everything of the Bible authors was included in the final document. Already churches had sprung up around the teaching of Jesus. And as happens whenever and wherever people gather in groups around a powerful idea, there were certain individuals within these churches or enclaves who determined what parts of the Jesus story was going to be told and how. This process of selecting and editing continued throughout the gathering, writing, and publishing of the Gospels and the Bible. Even several centuries after the original scriptures were committed to writing, God says a high council of the church determined yet one more time which doctrines and truths were to be included in the then official Bible and which would be unhealthy or premature to reveal to the masses. And there have been other holy scriptures as well, each placed in writing in moments of inspiration by otherwise ordinary men, none of whom were any more crazy than you. So right here, we hear God talk about what we're willing to look at. You know, we're willing to look at the writings of others and trust that they were from God. But like Neale, we don't trust that the inspirations that comes to us are reliable. God talks about the many edits and re-edits that the Bible had undergone, that even after several centuries after the original scriptures were committed, a high council of the church determined which doctrines and truths were to be included in the official Bible and which scriptures they deemed to be unhealthy or premature to disclose to the people. I have a couple questions. Do you think they removed scriptures relating to powerful women of God? Absolutely, they did. Do you think they thought it would be inappropriate to keep the scriptures pertaining to sexual energy? You better believe it. Do you think they thought it would be premature to reveal to the masses how Jesus talked about overcoming the body, that we're powerful creators, that we share God's love and power? Why would they tell the masses that? They knew that they could not control the people if they told them that. So of course they left that information out. It was not in their best interest to keep that in there. So God is basically making a point that, you know, we're always going to these sources and they're supposed to be more legitimate than ours, but investigate if they're even actually right. So I'm going to continue on page 68. And so Neale says, are you suggesting, you're not suggesting, are you, that these writings might one day become holy scriptures? So Neale was like, you're not suggesting that what I'm writing with you is going to be a holy scripture. And God says, my child, everything in life is holy. By that measure, yes, these are holy writings, but I will not quibble with you over words because I know what you mean. God says, no, I do not suggest that this manuscript will one day become holy scripture, at least not for several hundred years or until the language becomes outmoded. You see, the problem is that the language here is too colloquial, too conversational, too contemporary. People assume that if God were to talk directly with you, God would not sound like the fella next door. There should be some unifying, if not to say deifying, structure to the language, some dignity, some sense of godliness. As I said earlier, that's part of the problem. People have a sense of God as showing up in only one form. Anything which violates that form is seen as blasphemy. And Neale said, as I said earlier, and God said, yeah, as you said earlier. So I love what God says right here, y'all. I love how he makes fun of the limited way that we have been conditioned to think. God is saying that because Neale's dialogue with him is not outdated, not because he's not saying ye and yea, or that we're having to go over and be confused about the language, since it's not like that, since God is talking in a clear and simple way that we understand, that people wouldn't believe that Neale is actually talking to God. We actually don't have to be confused while reading this conversation, but that's what makes it so beautiful. And that's the answer to life, right? We get questions answered clearly and plainly. So I love that part. So God says, but let's drive to the heart of your question. Why do you think it's crazy for you to be able to have a dialogue with God? Do you believe in prayer? And Neale says, yes, but that's different. Prayer for me has always been one way. I ask and God remains immutable. And God says, God has never answered a prayer. And Neale said, oh, yes, but never verbally, you see, you know, oh, I've had all kinds of things happen in my life that I was convinced were an answer, a very direct answer to prayer, but God has never spoken to me. And God says, I see. So this God in which you believe, this God can do anything. It just cannot speak. And Neale says, of course, God can speak if God wants to. It just doesn't seem probable that God would want to speak to me. And God says, this is the roots of every problem you experience in your life, for you do not consider yourself worthy enough to be spoken to by God. Good heavens, how can you ever expect to hear my voice if you don't imagine yourself to be deserving enough to even be spoken to? I tell you this, I am performing a miracle right now. For not only am I speaking to you, but to every person who has picked up this book and is reading these words. To each of them, I am now speaking. I know who every one of them is. I know now who will find their way to these words. And I know that just as with all my other communications, some will be able to hear and some will be able to only listen, but will hear nothing. And so Neale says, well, that brings up another thing, I'm already thinking of publishing this material now as it's being written. And God says, yes, what's wrong with that? And Neale says, can it be argued that I'm creating this whole thing for profit? Doesn't that render a whole thing suspect? And God said, is it your motive to write something so that you can make a lot of money? And Neale says, no, that's not why I started this. I began this dialogue on paper because my mind has been plagued with questions for 30 years. Questions I've been hungry, starving to have answered. The idea that I would have all this made into a book came later. And God says, from me. The idea came from me. And Neale says, from you? And God says, yes. You don't think I was going to let you waste all these marvelous questions and answers, do you? And Neale says, I hadn't thought about that. At the outset, I just wanted the questions answered, the frustration to end, the search to be over. And God says, good. So stop questioning your motives. You do it incessantly, and let's get on with it. And so right here we read that Neale started to judge his desire to turn his dialogue with God into a book, even though the idea came from God. How do we do this to ourselves, where we have a fantastic idea and then talk ourselves out of it because of a conditioned judgment we have found about it? Listen carefully, everyone. Every creative thought you have, every business idea, every desire to write a book or be a life coach or anything you can think of that gives you joy absolutely comes from God. And the fact that it can also make you money does not contaminate it. We have talked about this where we have been conditioned to believe that making money to do something that we enjoy somehow cheapens what we do. Why would not this be the whole purpose of raising our vibrations? Would this not be a fifth dimensional experience to get paid for doing that which we love? Let's continue to release those beliefs that do not serve us. So now we're going to fast forward a couple of years. And at this point, Neale So he's written and published book 1, and he's written and published book 2. But he hadn't published it. He's written it. But he still really doesn't believe that they're going to actually be published, right? He memorialized the conversations he had with God and considered them to be his own personal private journaling. So by the time he writes book 3, books 1 and 2 were on the New York Times bestsellers. And so at this point, he's realizing that everything he writes is going to be read by millions. And so now by the time he gets into book 3, he's very intimidated and self-conscious about his words, because he realized people are going to be reading, and then they're waiting on this last book. So I'm going to start from book 3 on page 8 through 11. And so this is Neale's whole opening. Before he even asks God a question, he opens with this. He says, for the first time since 1992, when all this began, I seemed to be resisting this process, if not almost resenting it. I'm feeling trapped by this assignment, and I've never liked to do anything I have to do. Further, having distributed to a few people uncorrected copies of the first manuscript and heard their reactions to it, I'm now convinced that all 3 of these books will be widely read, thoroughly examined, analyzed for theological relevance, and passionately debated for dozens of years. That has made it very difficult to come to this page, very difficult to consider this pen my friend. For while I know this material must be brought through, I know that I am opening myself up to the most scurrilous attacks, the ridicule, and perhaps even the hatred of many people for daring to put forth this information, much less for daring to announce that it is coming to me directly from God. And Neale continues, he says, I think my greatest fear is that I will prove to be an inadequate, inappropriate spokesperson for God, given the seemingly endless series of mistakes and misdeeds which have marked my life and characterized my behavior. He says, those who have known me from my past, including former wives and my own children, would have every right to step forward and denounce these writings based on my lackluster performance as a human being in the simple rudimentary functions of husband and father. He says, I have failed miserably at this. And at other aspects of life having to do with friendship and integrity, industry, and responsibility. I am, in short, keenly aware that I am not worthy to represent myself as a man of God or a messenger of truth. I should be the last person to assume such a role or to even presume to. I do an injustice to the truth by presuming to speak it, when my whole life has been a testimony to my weaknesses. And so he says, for these reasons, God, I ask that you relieve me of my duties as your scribe, and that you find someone else, someone whose life renders them worthy of such an honor. So God responds and says, I should like to finish what we started here. though you are under no obligation to do so. You have no duties to me or to anyone else, though I see that your thoughts that you do has led you to much guilt. And Neale says, I have let people down, including my own children. And God says, everything that has happened in your life has happened perfectly in order for you and all the souls involved with you to grow in exactly the way that you've needed and wanted to grow. And Neale says, that is the perfect out constructed by everyone in the new age who wishes to escape responsibility for their actions and avoid any unpleasant outcomes. I feel that I've been selfish, incredibly selfish, most of my life, doing what pleases me, regardless of its impact on others. And God says, there's nothing wrong in doing what pleases you. And Neale says, but so many people have been hurt, let down. And God says, there is only the question of what pleases you most. You seem to be saying that what now pleases you most are behaviors which do little or no damage to others. And Neale says, that's putting it mildly. And so God says, on purpose, you must learn to be gentle with yourself and stop judging yourself. And I love that. I love that. So God tells him that he would like to complete the work that they started. He tells him, do not worry about what other people think of him and don't get caught up on being perfect. And he also says something that's worth repeating and putting on our refrigerator. On purpose, intentionally, you must learn to be gentle with yourself and stop judging yourself. I'm going to continue. And so Neale says, that's hard, particularly when others are so ready to judge. I feel I'm going to be an embarrassment to you, to the truth, that if I insist on completing and publishing this trilogy, I will be such a poor ambassador for your message as to discredit it. And so God says, you cannot discredit truth. Truth is truth, and it can neither be proven nor disproven. It simply is. God says, the wonder and the beauty of my message cannot and will not be affected by what people think of you. Indeed, you are one of the best ambassadors because you have lived your life in a way that you call less than perfect. People can relate to you, even as they judge you. And if they see that you are truly sincere, they can even forgive you your sordid past, he puts in quotes. Yet I tell you this, so long as you are still worried about what others think of you, you are owned by them. Only when you require no approval from outside yourself can you own yourself. Only then can you own yourself. And so Neale says, my concern was more for the message than for me. I was concerned that the message would get besmirched. And God says, if you're concerned about the message, then get the message out. Do not worry about besmirching it. The message will speak for itself. Remember what I have taught you. It is not nearly so important how well a message is received as how well it is sent. Remember this also, you teach what you have to learn. It is not necessary to have achieved perfection to speak of perfection. It is not necessary to have achieved mastery to speak of mastery. It is not necessary to have achieved the highest level of evolution to speak of the highest level of evolution. Seek only to be genuine. Strive to be sincere. If you wish to undo all the damage you imagine yourself to have done, demonstrate that in your actions. Do what you can do. Then I love his next statement. He says, then let it rest. Basically, release it. Do the best you can do and release it. So my next point is, imagine if Neale had listened to his ego and worries about what other people thought of him. What if his insecurities of not being good enough had prevented him from publishing his books? I know that for me personally, Conversations with God has become just an incredible resource to understand many secrets of who we are, why we are here, how we create. It provides a roadmap to many of life's questions, and the conversational platform of the books enable them to be enlightening while being easy to read as well. It's not complicated. In the same way, there are dreams and passions that we all have set out to accomplish specifically during this incarnation. We have forgotten the plans that we made before we were born, before we put on the veil of forgetfulness. But our internal guidance system is always here to lead us right back to our purpose. How do we know what our mission is? Our internal guidance system gives us clues through those things which give us joy, those things you imagine yourself doing when you are happiest, those things which you do, when you do it, you lose time. Your passions, things that come to you naturally, are all indications of your soul's purpose. And yes, our purpose is multi-layered. It's not just one thing. We have many gifts to share. And so when you have your inspirations, right? When you have those things that gives you joy, when you have those bright ideas, which make you smile, and when that voice comes up and tell you how you cannot accomplish your dream, remind that voice of who you are. Remind your ego that God has plans for you, plans to prosper you and to not harm you. Remind that voice that you are a bright spark of light. You are made in the image of your source. Remind that voice that the world would suffer without your gifts, without your talents, without your love. Remind that voice that this is the reason you are here, to do all that you are inspired to do. And I want to close out with the dialogue that Neale had with God once he started like throwing away his insecurities and really kind of got inspired in the way that only God can inspire us. I wanted to close out on what Neale said, and it is on page 77. So God says, the bottom of 77, God says, be a bringer of the light, for your light can do more than illuminate your own path. Your light can be the light which truly lights the world. Shine on then, shine on, that the moment of your greatest darkness may yet become your grandest gift. And even as you are gifted, so too will you gift others, giving to them the unspeakable treasure, themselves. Let this be your task. Let this be your greatest joy, to give people back to themselves, even in their darkest hour, especially in their darkest hour. The world awaits for you. Heal it now in the place where you are. There is much you can do. He says, for my sheep are lost and must now be found. But ye therefore as good shepherds, be ye therefore as good shepherds and lead them back to me. And so Neale says, thank you. Thank you for that call. And thank you for that challenge. Thank you for that placement of the goal before me. Thank you for always keeping me headed in the right direction. You know, I really want to take. That is why I come to you. That is why I have loved and blessed this dialogue, for it is in conversation with you that I find the divine within you and begin to see it within all others. And God says, my dearly beloved, the heavens rejoice when you say that. That is the very reason I have come to you and will come to everyone who calls to me, even as I have come now to those others who are reading these words. For this conversation was never intended to be with you alone. It was intended for millions around the world. And it has been placed in each person's hand just exactly when they have needed it. Sometimes in the most miraculous ways. It has brought them to the wisdom they themselves have called forward, perfectly suited for this moment in their lives. This is the wonder of what has been happening here, that each of you, he's talking to us now, is producing this result by yourself. It looks as if someone else gave you this book, brought you to this conversation, opened you to this dialogue, yet you brought yourself here. So let us now explore together the remaining questions to which you have held in your heart. What a love letter. What a love letter. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. So that's it for that lesson. And oh my gosh, it's almost 7 o'clock. Does anybody have any comments, questions, impressions? Are you inspired? Hey, Miata. Hi, Kevin. So does anybody have anything? Let me see what the chat is talking about. Ebony said, yes, yes, thank you, thank you.
Girl, me on fire over here.
Yes. How are you?
I'm good. That was just awesome. Just about how, about the woman. Did God forget about women and how he talks to us and how we are the light, not just for ourselves, but the entire world. And Loretta, I know it's people other than us on this line, but baby, you was my light, girl. Thank you for my light. Thank you.
Welcome, thank
I'm serious.
you.
I can just remember, just when you said that the light is not just for you, it's to be shined through the world and for millions to see. And you really reached me like 5 years ago, and it's just been leading ever since. You are such a light, and I'm so thankful for you and this space and everyone on here.
Girl, you gonna have me cry. Why now? What, Ebony? Why you gonna have me crying on this?
Because
Thank
I'm
you.
tired of being the only one crying.
Thank you so much, lady. And you know our conversations. You have definitely have a light as well. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you. Anybody else have any impressions? This was powerful, right? Like this was so inspiring. I love Neale's example. I love his vulnerability. I love his vulnerability. Um, because we all, I don't know about y'all, but we always kind of feel like, oh, okay, that's not for me, that's for special people, or that's, where we always maybe think that somebody else has something that we just don't have. And, God communicates with other people, but he was the consummate example of, no, God speaks to each and every last one of us. We just need to learn how to recognize his voice. That we and some of that comes from growing up, that church culture too, where you feel like, oh, man, I'm a mess. I can't go to church now. I got to get myself together for me to go to church. Like you got to be fixed
or take communion. Okay.
Yes, yes. You got to get yourself right. But it's like, no, God meets us where we are. So oh my God, when I was preparing this session, I was like, I love this. It's so juicy. Anybody else have anything? Miata said, yes, Ebony. And Kevin said, good evening.
Brittany got her hand raised.
Who?
Brittany.
Brittany. What's up, Brittany?
Oh, hey, thank you for saying that, Ebony. I don't know how the Zoom works too well.
Okay, what's going on, Brittany?
I did. I really enjoyed the background of Conversations with God, because that showed me like Neale is just a regular person. Because before, I enjoyed the book very much because I could feel the truth in it. Yeah. But I always imagined Neale being like some higher up person that's gone through all this, internal work, and he wasn't just a regular person like me, and God was talking to him. So that was very helpful. Where it's like, oh wow, this is, and he's asking all the questions that I would ask. So it was very helpful.
Thank you. That's the beauty of it. Thank you so much for that, Brittany. Yes, that is the assumption, right? Like a lot of times we look at authors and we look at, spiritual people, and we just assume that they're this superpower, but no, girl, I could not even hit all of the insecurities in these 3 books. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week too, because we're going to be talking about, God, what is the thing? We're going to be talking more about Neale, his insecurities next week as well. Like I couldn't even get to all of them, because it was just to that degree where he just had a rough life. But I think that is why he was that perfect person, because we do make that assumption that, this person just was born, spiritual, born in a cross-leg position in a meditative stance, like they just got it, but that's not the case. That is not the case. So, it is 7 o'clock, y'all. I'm not gonna hold y'all late. As a matter of fact, I think I'm gonna just go ahead and release y'all tonight without doing the meditation, because I don't want to hold y'all too late. So yes, thank you everyone for joining. It has been nice. If nobody else has anything to share, we can close it out. I love y'all.